tonight is going to be in some way, shape, and form just setting the stage. My goal tonight is to create some plausibility structures for what we're going to do beginning next week. But important. And so I would love for you to come back. Before we start, let's pray. Lord, thank you for the evening. Thank you for the sunshine. Lord, we are reminded as the plants begin to grow and the apple blossoms are falling off the tree that you sustain everything. And spring is a wonderful reminder of your faithfulness. And Lord, we thank you for the opportunity tonight to chat together, to consider this book that you have provided, and we ask that you would just guide us in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, so why the Gospel of John? Well, as many of you know, I got to spend a 3 years up at Regent College, getting to study and do a degree in biblical studies and focus on biblical languages. And one of the things that I got to do my final year at Regent was to focus quite a bit on the Gospel of John. I did a lot of reading, good deal of writing about it, and in particular, aside from just the Gospel of John, the Gospels in particular have sort of captured my imagination. And I hope that one of the things that comes out of the time that we have together is that you also might just have a sort of just capture just a little bit of the inkling to go for yourselves and to kind of continue wrestling after this 5 weeks is over. I think the Gospel of John is a fascinating piece of writing, and I'm just so I'm excited to be able to talk about it. Welcome here, Toby. That being the case, in order to tackle our question, one of the questions, what inspirations may lay behind John's gospel? What we first need to do is we need to look at, what are the gospels in general? What are the other gospels, what we typically call the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke? What are they like? Before we can actually begin to look at what makes John unique and even have the ability to ask the question, what is the author potentially, doing, thinking as he's reflecting on his time interacting with Jesus. So what I want to do tonight is I want to begin by accessing our prior knowledge collectively about what we know about the Gospels. Synoptics, John, you all have pieces of paper right now, okay? And some of you have pens, some of you don't. If you don't, you've got your mind. But what I'd like you to do right now is I'd like you to take 2 minutes on your own, and on the back of this sheet of paper, anything that you think you know about the Gospels in general. And also, I'll repeat, also, anything you think you know about differences between John's gospel and the 3 synoptic gospels. Not that the 3 synoptic gospels say the exact same thing, but any differences you might be aware of. Okay, so take 2 minutes in the silence of your own space, and then we'll do a little share out. Okay, finish up that last thing. There is a public service announcement to be given real quickly.
We're going to be passing a basket around. We'll pass lots of money. No. Gutenberg would be eternally grateful if you would consent to, if you have something to say, let me hand you the microphone so that people who are on the recording will know what it is that Ryan is interacting with when stuff happens. I would appreciate it greatly.
So Ron, just briefly, for this like throwing up of things up here, can we maybe skip that for that?
Don't look at me. I'm have instructions from the president of the college.
I know,
You're
the
gonna have to talk to
Patreons
him.
are gonna hate this. This is all this dead space. Yeah, I could repeat. Let me for this we'll repeat. Okay. So what I'd like you to do right now is I'd like you to turn to the person next to you or behind you or in front of you, and I want you to share with them what is it that you think you know about the Gospels in general, or specific things that you know about the differences between Synoptics and John. See what someone else, if someone got something that you didn't get, write it on your own piece of paper. And if someone's wrong, just tell them, listen, don't say that out loud. Come on back. Depending on what your answers are tonight, we may just shut this whole thing down. We may be done. Okay, so what I would like for you to do is, you notice that I'm trying to make this a bit interactive because I think it's valuable when we get to sort of realize that, okay, we know stuff. Like, we're not just coming in cold, right? I know something, and then collectively we get to kind of help each other. So my goal is to make this not totally interactive the whole time, because I've got some stuff to say, and but my goal is to really have this be something where we're kind of helping each other. I am a student, okay? And I've thought about some of this stuff and spent time about this, but I'm also still learning myself. So, and there is a collective knowledge in here that together is way beyond anything that I have personally, right? So I want to acknowledge that. But if you would be willing to just like throw it out, we don't have to raise hands. If you happen to get someone else yelling your thing at the same time, you yelled your thing and you didn't think I heard it, like, go for it. But like, what do we know? What do we know? Let's take a few minutes and just kind of acknowledge this. Yeah, Christine.
I would just like to represent all the people like myself who are here because they need to be, because they don't know much.
Okay, okay.
And all those people that were embarrassed to turn to the next person and say, I don't have a clue.
Hey.
I am here.
Thank you for, I want to honor that honesty. Thank you. Yes. Okay, Toby, what do you got? Thank you, Christine.
Now you have to repeat what she said.
Yeah. Yeah. Ben was my friend. Toby.
So now, the figurative language, the poetic language, John versus some more
Okay.
literal or narrative elements of the.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Oh yeah, so figurative, poetic language of John versus what is perceived to be less so, less poetic, less figurative of the Synoptic Gospels. Okay. Yes.
He seems to be less confrontational about the failure with the law, and he seems to be more talking about himself.
In John. Okay, so Jesus, did you say less confrontational or more confrontational? Okay, with the disciples or with people in general? Okay, less confrontational. Okay. Okay, about their failure to keep the law. Okay. All right. I may not agree with that, but we'll see. We'll see. That's good. That's good. Robbie. Ah, yes.
Because he has like Jesus going back and forth to Galilee and Jerusalem, whereas the other is not the gospel.
Okay, so you said two things. One is, and I think I'm glad you said that, there's this whole theme of this notion of witness or testimony that is really, unique to John in certain ways. Not that the Synoptic Gospels don't have eyewitness accounts that are incorporated into them, but John seems to bring this out and actually talk about it in the way that the Synoptics don't. You also mentioned something else, an issue around geography, the difference in geography. In John in particular, we see Jesus going to Jerusalem several times, right? And how many times does he go to Jerusalem in the Synoptic Gospels? He goes one time, okay? The Synoptics know and share about one specific time, and that is the week before he dies, right? He shows up to die in Jerusalem. And that's his one time in Jerusalem within the Synoptics, okay? What else do we know? Anything else? One second, Robbie, 1 second.
John or everything, the rest of the
Anything, either one.
I was thinking about Matthew. There's a focus on the genealogy and the line of Jesus through the Leviticus credibility.
Okay, so in Matthew, there's a genealogy of Jesus. Does anyone know what other gospel also includes a genealogy? Luke. So Luke also has that. John doesn't know a genealogy. John doesn't have one. Okay?
Jesus actually redefines righteousness for people.
Okay? So this ethical teaching of Jesus that we often get a lot of in the Synoptic Gospels. Sermon on the Mount is in Matthew. There's a thing like it in Luke that gets labeled the Sermon on the Plain. A lot of the material that Matthew incorporates in his sermon is set in a different setting at a different time within Jesus' ministry. And Luke, we don't have in John a lot of this ethical, like we're stopping the narrative and where Jesus is just kind of teaching parables, ethics, about righteousness. There's a different kind of thing that Jesus is often doing when he's speaking in the Gospel of John. Thank you, Larry.
Written years after the fact.
Okay, so is this just what we know? Or is that something? Okay. Yeah. So in general, the Gospels were written years after Jesus, and we're all Christians here. Many of us will say he ascends, right? Not dies. So yeah, written years after Jesus ascends. Now, the question about when, all that kind of stuff, when was the first gospel written, when was the last gospel written, which was the first, which was the last, we may touch on that. Does anyone know generally who or which of the four is considered to be, and this is a general consensus nowadays, but which of the four was considered to be the first gospel written? Mark. Yeah, that's right. So Mark was written first. And consensus-wise, does anyone know where John generally is believed to have been written within that scope of the four Gospels? First, second, third, or fourth? Last, yeah. So Mark generally first, John considered to be last. Okay? All right? Two more. Chris.
I want to go back to the genealogy and make an observation. Matthew's goes back to David.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this.
Well, Matthew's goes back to.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Luke's goes back
to Abraham.
Adam. Is that not correct?
I think Matthew's goes back to Abraham.
Okay.
Yeah.
But my point is that Luke goes back even further, and then
yes,
I want to bring John into the conversation because John begins prior to creation, at creation, which I think also has something to do with kind of the cosmic perspective that John has on. There's a lot of light and darkness, that sort of thing. That might tie into the figurative poetic language as well.
Okay.
Just
yeah.
to make an observation about the genealogy and the beginnings of Jesus' story.
No, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. So just pointing out the differences for all those folks back in Patreon land, all the differences between the genealogy. Luke's goes all the way back to Adam. Matthew goes back to Abraham. John, while he doesn't have a formal genealogical record, John's prologue has this very interesting beginning that places at least what he's calling the Logos prior to anything else existing, right? So there, I appreciate you pointing that out. And we're going to get here week 2 and week 3. So anyone want to have a last word? Ben?
So I couldn't prove this right now, but in my head I thought that when I read the Synoptic Gospels, they don't always seem to really support as much like the salvation by grace through faith. Protestant thinking. A lot of the Synoptic Gospels, you kind of like scratch your head more, raise your eyebrows more. Whereas when I read John, it's more it kind of fits in more with like how Paul describes the gospel. And
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting that you bring that up. I think that other people have, I think, tended to note that there is something seemingly different about the way John kind of talks about salvation in Jesus and the life, the eternal life that he's bringing, and maybe grace, but certainly, we have that infamous passage, or famous passage of John 3:16, and that the synoptics don't have any kind of corollary, like aside statements that John can sometimes make, reflective statements that either Jesus is saying or John is saying about things with respect to eternal life. Yeah. Good. Okay. So this is some good stuff. Thank you for participating. We will be doing some more participation as we go. I really want this to be, again, like I said, an opportunity for us to dialogue. So if there is a question, if you have something that you are like, oh, you just said that, I want to follow up on that. If you want to raise your hand, Ron will bring you the microphone. I may say, hey, when you ask that question, can we wait? Or I may not like call on you just yet. I may get to a stopping point, but I do want you to feel the freedom to just be like, okay, I need to know that thing before we move on so that I'm clear. So feel free to do that. Okay, so why does, and this is under my introduction, why does my essential question matter? What inspirations may lay behind John's unique portrayal of Jesus? On the one hand, why does it matter? I mean, here we have a narrative about an individual that is one among four narratives, right? And we know that the subject of the narrative is this man that we, as at least those of us who claim the name Christian, that we believe that this individual, Jesus, the subject of these narrative accounts, actually lived, actually said what he is reported to have said, actually did what he is reported to have done, and died and was resurrected, and, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, it's like, well, what's the question, Ryan? Are you begging something that isn't really a question? Like these are just the stories of Jesus. These are just the accounts of what he did, of what he said. And that on the one hand is true. I want to acknowledge that, and I want to be very clear that within modern biblical scholarship, a lot of biblical scholars will take a look at these gospel accounts and they'll notice that Matthew's Jesus stilling of the storm account is different than Mark's Jesus of the stilling of the storm account. And in Matthew's account, after Jesus stills the storm, they worship him, his disciples. And in Mark's account, you know, they are completely afraid of him. There's no mention of this worship. You know, who is this that he can still the storm? So what's the deal? Like, well, someone's making something up, right? Someone's telling us something or not telling us something. And that may be true that sometimes not all the gospel writers tell us everything. So I just want to acknowledge that I am, like, straight up, that I am not someone who is going to make a claim over the next 5 weeks that the gospel writers were playing fast and loose with what Jesus said and did, or making things up or putting things in his mouth. Okay, so I want to acknowledge that straight up. So we come back to the question, why does your question matter? Well, I think it matters because I want to be a good reader of the text that we were given. Okay? We've been given 4 narratives about the life of Jesus, the Messiah. And each of those narratives includes details about his life. Some of them overlap with each other, some of them don't. And in John, we have a lot of details about Jesus that don't have corollaries per se in the synoptic accounts. Okay? So why this matters to me is because I want to be a good reader of the text, because I want you to be a good reader of the text. One of the things that traditionally Christianity has done with the 4 gospel accounts is they've thrown up their hands and they've tried to just figure out how they all fit together and harmonize everything. And while recognizing that while Mark may say something that seems like it contradicts with Luke, that seems like it may contradict with John about a particular topic, a particular event, a particular thing that Jesus said, my goal is to, I'm sort of the question of harmonization is fine. I understand the need. Like, okay, well, there is truth. Something happened, and I'm just sort of assuming that whatever it was that actually happened, these 4 narratives are triangulating that thing. And people do a lot of work to sort of make sure that we as Christians can sort of take hope in the fact that we're not being given contradictory information about Jesus. Okay? And that's good, and that's fine. But one of the things, and I this is a quote from a book by Richard Bauckham, who is a Bible scholar, spent a lot of time studying and writing about the Gospels in particular. And he says this, conflation of the Gospels or attempts at harmonization denies each Gospel the integrity of its own distinctive portrayal of Jesus. It creates, that is, the harmonization process, harmony too soon before the diversity has ever been noticed. Okay? Now, again, I am not against harmonization. I think that is a worthwhile project, but that is not my interest. My interest for these 5 weeks is to pay particular attention to John's narrative about Jesus. Okay? And in order to pay particular attention to John's narrative about Jesus, we need to be able to, for a time, set aside what we sort of, this desire to harmonize the text, and just focus on what are the details of John, what is the story John is telling us? Is John telling us about the same story, about the same Jesus, the same events that a lot of the synoptics are? Yes. Is he making stuff up? No. Did the synoptic folks make stuff up? No, they did not. Okay, but I want to focus on the details of John's text because I want to know what John had to say about Jesus, because at least the text of John would have us believe that John himself was an eyewitness to the events that he writes about in the text that he has provided for us. And so his personal reflection, his personal angle, his personal attempts at locating Jesus in the salvation story of the God of Israel and how Jesus is connected to that story. That's what I want to be interested in with us for the next 5 weeks. Okay, I want to pay attention to John's narrative, right? I forgot to mention Tatian, 2nd century. Christians, for a long time have been trying to deal with the problems of harmonizing the Gospels, and his was the first gospel harmony that was written. And interestingly, one of the famous texts of John, the woman caught in adultery, which most of our best manuscripts on the text of John do not include. Also, in the 2nd century, when Tatian was writing this gospel harmony, he doesn't include that in his gospel harmonization either. But anyway, this, yeah, exactly. Yep, it was, he who has, he has no sin cast the first stone. So I want to appreciate that desire to harmonize, but I'm going to move away from it in order, as Bauckham says, to notice the distinctions, notice the differences, to ask the question, how can we better understand John's perspective on Jesus and what his reflection is bringing to us? So, any questions before I move on from that?
Can you say a little bit more about Baukham's quote, conflation of the Gospels or attempts at harmonization denies each Gospel the integrity of its own distinctive portrayal of Jesus. It creates harmony too soon before diversity has ever been noticed. Why would you harmonize if you hadn't noticed the diversity?
Well, that's a good question, Jack. I think that, he, in this particular section, he talks about just that historical movement of the Christian church to sort of basically throw up their hands and say, oh, why do we have 4? Like, let's figure out how to like make this thing like a sort of a unified story and kind of like get rid of the seeming inconsistencies that, these texts, these disparate texts are offering us. So, obviously that was noticed, and that was a move that, because they had noticed the diversity, that provided the reasoning behind wanting to harmonize, wanting to conflate. Yeah, I understand that you're kind of asking like the question, why would Bauckham say like put the cart before the horse? But yeah.
And it seems to me that you have to have a dialectic between the background material and John's text. You can't just interpret John's text. You have to interpret John's text in the context of the resources that the background gives you.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like the Synoptic Gospels are background material to John's text.
Right.
So why wouldn't we want to go back and forth between my harmonization of John with the Synoptic Gospels and whatever I am noticing that's distinctive in John?
Well, that's right. And that's why my goal, one of the main parts of wanting to set the table tonight, is wanting to really look more distinctly at, okay, what do we have in the synoptics? What are the synoptics? How are they structured? What is the narrative arc of the synoptics? So that we can kind of locate John in distinction to them, and we will certainly be doing that as we go. So maybe I overstated my intention, which is to simply say it's important that in asking the question that I'm asking, we using the synoptics as a backdrop, as a background, can be really helpful in that process for sure. But not for the goal of making sure that we just harmonize and conflate and kind of are triangulating on particular events, but rather the goal of noticing the differences so that we can be able to potentially answer a question like the one I posed. And then, so Ron, I'm going to let you ask the question, then we're going to move on, unless anyone else.
That's fine. Go ahead.
No, go for it.
Well, I don't know Bauckham, but I was taking what he was saying a little differently there. Just that sense of before diversity has been noticed. I assumed that what he meant was that the move to harmonize can make it so that I'm not really paying attention to those differences in the texts that might indicate a purpose of the author. Like
Right.
in Matthew, is there a significance to the fact we have these 5 groupings of text teachings, like the Sermon on the Mount and so forth? Partly the reason I think of that is because this is something that I had to learn myself. When I first started studying the Gospels, I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to the flow of each Gospel story.
Yeah.
I just kind of, okay, so here's where Jesus talks about this topic. Let me go look up all the other places where he talks about that stuff in the other Gospels, and I'll throw them together and figure out what the big picture is.
Right.
I agree there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but I actually fell into the trap of not paying a lot of attention to, is there some reason that Matthew has put things together a little differently than the other guys do? So in that sense, that's what I was taking him as saying, is that
Right.
that it can kind of, before you notice that Matthew has a purpose in the way he's put things together, I have made it my goal to make the text this big back. So, but I agree with what Jack's saying. I mean, if we're saying we're not going to try to figure out how these texts relate to each other in terms of the reality behind them, the background and everything, if I make that my goal, instead I'm just going to look at this text and I'm not going to think about the other texts, I would agree that's
Right.
not a smart way to go either.
No, and I appreciate that. I appreciate both the comments. The goal is to be very cognizant of the reality of the differences, the reality that the synoptics present a certain way, and John is presenting in some ways in other ways, and we want to ask those questions. So that's important. You sure? Okay, so all right, so I want to drop down to number 2. I want to talk briefly about gospel structure. And again, right now I'm talking in terms of all gospels, not necessarily or particularly the synoptics or John. Most of us know that how the Gospels tend to be handled, right, is by breaking them up into these smallish chunks that seem to fit with these small vignettes or moments from Jesus's life, right? We get that Jesus He lived for probably 33 years or so. his ministry based on the chronological work that people have done between the Synoptics and John is dated to be about 3 years, his public ministry. And so during this time, what we don't have is a video camera that's following Jesus around, right? What we have is these moments that have been selected by the gospel writers, strung together with each other, more or less seemingly in a chronological fashion, okay? And some of the synoptics, as we pointed out, start back with, like Matthew starts with Jesus's birth, Luke starts with Jesus's birth, and then moves forward that way. Mark starts with the baptism of Jesus, and John doesn't have a baptism, assumes the baptism, doesn't have a birth narrative, but it has this really interesting prologue, right? And after the beginnings, then we have these little moments, like Jesus going out into the wilderness, Jesus teaching, Jesus healing the lepers, Jesus doing this, Jesus talking about a parable of the mustard seed, Jesus, et cetera, et cetera. So, and typically, we in general Christianity, we sort of like tend to like to make sense of what we're reading, and the Gospels are really large with respect to biblical material. It's hard to sort of keep the whole in view, and so we often kind of focus on just these little moments, right? And these little moments have been strung together for us by the gospel writers. And, in biblical studies, they call these little moments pericopes or units or whatever. And so we have these pericopes, these units strung together, and more or less they seem to be chronological, moving down the road, Jesus ultimately ending up in Jerusalem and dying and being resurrected. So the granular level, we typically are approaching the gospel text by looking at these little snippets, one at a time, okay? And as you know, like in the Christian sort of tradition, oftentimes sermons will be focused on a particular pericope 1 week, and then they'll go to the next one the next week, and so on and so forth, okay? And so because of this, because the gospel texts are so long in themselves, because there's so much varied material, we often tend to not recognize that the Gospels are also in themselves meta-narratives of this ministry of Jesus, okay? That the Gospels themselves are telling a story, telling a true story about this Messiah who's moving from point A to point Z, all right? And the structure of the story from gospel to gospel varies a little bit between the synoptics, but generally it's pretty much a similar structure. But John is quite different. The structure of John, as Robbie mentioned, reads, the meta-narrative of John reads quite differently. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to sort of establish for us what the synoptics do with their sort of narrative of Jesus's life before we look at John. Where did my black pen go? Okay, so here's our timeline. And we've got our beginning of the gospel, we have our end of the gospel, and let's just assume we're talking about Mark. Mark is our first gospel that was likely written. Matthew and Luke have a lot of material that borrow from Mark's material, and then each of them have some of their own unique material, some of which they share together, and some of which is totally unique to each of them, okay? But in general, the arc of the story for the Synoptic Gospels is the same. And it is quite different from John's. Okay? Okay, so here's what I'd like you to do. Here's what I'd like you to do. On the back of your sheet of paper right now, I want you to take a minute to just sketch, think synoptic right now, and you may not know. I just want you to kind of sort of see what you think you might know about the arc of the story in the Synoptic Gospels. Where do they begin? How does it seem to kind of move along? Where does it end? Take a minute, see what you think you remember, and then we'll see what we can plot together here. Tell the person you're sitting next to what you think you know about the general arc of the Synoptic Gospels. So, in order to sort of kind of move through this, I'd love to hear from a few folks. I can't hear from a lot of folks, and then we'll kind of just see what we got. And then we're going to focus on what we see as different in John. Okay. And again, all of this is to really try to set the table for the real meat of what we're going in the next 4 weeks. All right. So someone want to take a shot at the synoptic narrative here? What's the synoptic narrative? Anyone want to take a shot at it?
Using Mark, is that what you said?
Using Mark. Yeah.
What we're going to dismiss. We're going to set aside the birth narrative if we start.
Yeah, that's right. We'll set aside the birth narrative and go for it. We'll assume B also refers to birth narrative, which is not in Mark. Okay, so right before the temptation is the baptism. That's where we start in Mark. We have the baptism. Then we've got this break. Okay, so Jesus gets baptized. The cloud voice in the overhead. This is my beloved son, and instantly Jesus is compelled out into the wilderness, where he is for how many days? 40 days. Okay, and once he comes back, generally, where does Jesus stay in the Synoptic Gospels for the first 2/3 of the gospel story? He stays in Galilee. Okay, so he's in Galilee. And what is he doing in Galilee? He's healing, he's teaching, he's wandering around the countryside. He's saying, we got to go over here, we got to go over there. He's forgiving sins. He's pissing people off. Okay, he is doing, miracles, mighty deeds, etc., etc. Okay, calling disciples. Thank you. Yeah. Sending his disciples out. All of this is happening generally within the confines of the Galilee, which is that northern end of Israel. And in the day of Jesus, you've got the Galilee in the north. You've got this area just below the Galilee that was called Samaria at the time, which was not considered to be a part of Israel. And then below Samaria, you have Judea, right? And of course, Judea is where Jerusalem is. And so you've got this nice long, 80 miles or something like that. So Jesus spends a good deal of his time in the text of Mark, in the text of Luke, in the text of Matthew, in the Galilee, right? And then there's one typical event that takes place that usually is a transition point for Jesus to move out of the Galilee in each of the Synoptic Gospels. Does anyone know what that transition moment is? Okay, it was a conversation. That happened around that is this the revealing, Jesus asking his questions of the disciples who do people say that I am? And of course, Peter comes out and he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And right after that, Jesus takes his disciples up onto the Mount of Transfiguration, okay? In pretty much all the synoptics, the Mount of Transfiguration kind of is a bookend on the far side of his Galilee ministry. And after he comes down from the Mount of Transfiguration, then the text is all leading in one direction. Where is he headed? Jerusalem, okay? All right. So Jesus goes to Jerusalem. Now, when he gets to Jerusalem, and you wouldn't know this from the Gospel of John because it's not there, right? But when he gets to Jerusalem, he's there for approximately a week. He comes in, he's hailed as Messiah on, on what we call as Palm Sunday, the week prior to his death. He comes in, he speaks over Jerusalem, the city that has killed the prophets, etc., how I've longed to, I don't exactly remember what he says, but bring you like a mother does her chicks, but you wouldn't have it. You wouldn't do the things that make for peace, and now you will be destroyed. And the entire week, generally speaking, in Mark, to a lesser or greater degree in Luke and Matthew, Jesus is in Jerusalem, he's in the temple, and he's cursing it. Okay? He goes into the temple, he basically walks out, basically saying, this is not what this is supposed to be. The disciples are all like amazed by how beautiful the environs of the temple are. And he says, yeah, all this stuff is going to be destroyed, right? So his time in Jerusalem is generally in the Synoptic Gospels is generally teaching, denouncing the rulers, denouncing the way in which the temple is being run, etc. He's cursing fig trees. He's doing lots of things. And then finally, he ends up dead, okay? He has, before he ends up on the cross, he's got that meal with his disciples and that sort of thing. But this is generally the arc of the narrative of the Synoptic Gospels, okay? Now, I want you to take 1 minute, okay, on your paper or with your partner right now, and I want you to ask yourself, what do I know about John's narrative, okay? Do I know, does John include all of these things? What do I think I might know about John's narrative? Take 1 minute to talk or write what you think you know. Go for it. So, okay. We've already kind of alluded to, Robbie mentioned this at the beginning, there's a difference in the geography and the difference in the structure of the narrative for John. What do we think we know? So where does John begin? And Chris mentioned that we've got a prologue that starts with, this logos in the beginning, prior to anything. So yes, we've got the prologue. Let's skip forward from the prologue. Does John have a birth narrative of Jesus? No. Does he have a baptism?
Sort of.
Sort of. Okay. John the Baptist at the very beginning, just like in Mark, John the Baptist is witnessing to Jesus. In Mark, he's witnessing to Jesus by baptizing him, right? He's also out preaching the forgiveness of sins, that sort of thing. In John, we have John the Baptist telling people that he's standing around, hey, when I baptized him, this is what happened, and I'm telling you so that you might know, blah, 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 that this is the Son of God. So John's witness about Jesus is what starts us off. All right. Now, we are not literally going to take, we don't even have the time to fill the 21 chapters here and figure out exactly where things go. But does Jesus go out in the wilderness in the Gospel of John? Okay, so we don't have the wilderness. All right. So after John's witness, does anyone know what's next? Okay, Nicodemus comes over here. Nicodemus comes over here. Yes. Okay. Now, thank you. So, and I'm, it's kind of like, let's play what's in the teachers and the Gospels sort of head. So here, just after John's witness, the first disciples come to Jesus, okay? And he brings them together and they go to a wedding, okay? They go to a wedding, all right? And he changes the water into wine. And John says that was the first of his signs, okay? Semea. He doesn't call them the traditional miracle word, duname, but he calls them signs. He says this is the first of the signs, all right? So he establishes some sort of order with this miracle that he does at Cana. And then instantly after that, we have this temple cleansing moment, okay? The very first thing that John records in Jesus's public ministry is Jesus in Jerusalem at the temple, cleansing the temple and telling the people, you want to know what my authority is and why I can say these things that I'm saying? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Okay, and that's his response to them. So now, interestingly, John records a temple cleansing here in chapter 2. The only time that we see Jesus in the temple in Jerusalem in the Synoptics is at the end of his life. Okay? Now, there's a whole lot of question and debate over whether or not Jesus, in the event that John records here in chapter 2, whether this is supposedly the same moment that Mark, Matthew, and Luke record at the end of his life here in the Synoptics. Okay, and we are going to talk about that question more probably in week 3 or 4. We're not going to discuss the ins and outs of that now, but suffice it to say, does Jesus visit the temple in John's gospel at the end of his life? Doesn't tell us. Okay, we do not have Jesus going to the temple in John's gospel narrative at the end of his life. Okay. Now, did he go to the temple at the end of his life? For sure, right? But John doesn't give us that information, right? Okay, so after the temple, we have the Nicodemus story, and, well, how do we want to do this? Anyone got anything else that they would like to tell us they know about what goes on this line, wherever it would go?
Samaritan woman, Canaanite woman.
Yeah. Okay. We could fill in a lot of details, but this is what I want to have us notice. Okay. Jesus is out here, not in Judea. Well, he's in the wilderness of Judea out here when he gets his first disciples, but he goes into Cana, which is up in Galilee, for the wedding. Chapter 2, the temple. Okay, he's in Jerusalem. All right. Nicodemus, he's still in Jerusalem, so we're going to keep that line going. After Nicodemus, he goes back out and he goes back north, and that's where we have the Samaritan woman. Okay. And he dialogues with her. And then after that, he goes from Samaria, he goes back up into Galilee, and he heals the nobleman's son at the end of chapter 4. He heals the nobleman's son. And then, once we get there, at the end of chapter 4, we transition back to Jerusalem. Okay, and in chapter 5, Jesus is in Jerusalem. we're gonna run out of space. We can go down here. Chapter 5, he's in Jerusalem for a feast. Does anyone know what feast he's in Jerusalem for? It doesn't actually explicitly say, but it's likely that he's there for Passover. Okay? Then, chapter 6, where we have Jesus feeding the multitude, okay? He's back in the Galilee. Okay? Chapter 7, where Jesus goes back up into Jerusalem. That's where his brothers say, hey, you going to go up for the feast? And Jesus is like, oh, no, I'm not going to go to the feast. You should go up. I'm not going to go up. But then he goes up in secret, right? So in chapter 7 and chapter 8 and chapter 9 and chapter 10, Jesus is in Jerusalem, okay? Chapter 11 is where we get the Lazarus story, and that's not in Jerusalem, but it's nearby, okay? And then, of course, chapter 12, he comes into Jerusalem on the final week of his life. Now, what do we notice? He's in Jerusalem a lot in John, okay? He's in Jerusalem a lot. Anything else?
Well, he's not interested in the sequential narrative of his life.
John seems, at least from the way we've mapped it out here, that, and especially with the question about the temple potentially looming, John doesn't appear to be interested in kind of giving us the chronological sequence, right? John's interested a lot in what Jesus says and does in Jerusalem. Why might that be? Why might John be interested in that? And remember where John is in the birth order of these Gospels.
He could be trying to make up for what he sees as what was missing in the Gospels that were written beforehand.
Okay, so John, typically considered probably likely the last of the living apostles, his witness about Jesus, he wants it to remain, he says at the end of his gospel. He knows of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And actually, Bauckham has written a very interesting essay on John likely being written in light of Mark. There's some merits to it. But one thing is for sure, John provides us with a lot of material that the Synoptic Gospels don't. Okay, so one of the very first things we notice is John seems to be wanting to give his account that fills in some holes. Okay, and in particular, and we'll look at this more when we in the coming weeks. In particular, there are particular sections where this Galilee ministry kind of comes down into, right? The feeding of the 5,000, the Galilee ministry like fits in here. And there's, if you've got your Bible, if you turn to John chapter 7, verse 1, okay? Between John chapter 7, verse 1, and John chapter 7, verse 2, probably is about 6 months, okay, where he says, and after these things, that is, Jesus is in Galilee, he's just fed the 5,000, and after these things, Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him, right? Now, verse 2, 6 months later, the feast of the Jews, the feast of booths, was at hand. The feast of booths is 6 months later in the calendar than Passover. Okay, so anyway, so there's these moments that the Gospel of John sort of notes in his narrative where there's these like verses that sort of account for, you know, all the time that Jesus is up in Galilee. Okay, what else? Why else might John do what he's doing? So he wants he wants to fill in information that's missing from the record. Anything else? He thinks it's important. Okay. Absolutely. He thinks it's important. Dick, were you going to say something? Or Logan?
It's as late as some people attribute it to be. The temple was gone.
Mm-hmm.
And trying, and John's life was as late as people say it was. His place in his own life and his audience would be radically different than, say, Matthew's or Mark's audience. So you would expect a different flavor,
Okay.
a different structure.
Potentially so. Yeah. Especially if, he's writing to an audience post 70 AD, potentially. Now, yeah. Okay. So one of the few other things to note. So one of the big things that seems to be driving John's narrative is he's focused on these signs, right? First sign at the wedding of Cana in Galilee, the sign of healing the nobleman's son. Chapter 4, chapter 5, he heals the man who was lame for 38 years, okay, in Jerusalem. The feeding of the 5,000, right? The healing of the man who was born blind, the raising of Lazarus, and then, the sign of the catch of fish at the very end in chapter 21. Another thing to note, Mark's gospel potentially ends really starkly, like the day of the resurrection. The disciples realize he's been raised, and they're kind of afraid, and the angels tell him, you're supposed to go back to Galilee where Jesus told you to meet you. And of course, John's ends quite a bit later with actually meeting Jesus back in Galilee, and the whole issue with Peter and reinstating Peter and that sort of thing. So the catch of fish, also a sign. So John's got this signs thing going on, and typically, depending on how you count, you got 7 or 8. All right. The other thing John has going on is, and again, it makes sense because Jesus is a Jew, right? Is the narrative seems, and we're always told that Jesus is going into Jerusalem for feasts, okay? For the main feasts. Now, there were 3 pilgrimage feasts, 3 main pilgrimage feasts: Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Booths, okay? And Jesus is found in Jerusalem and John on these feasts. There's another feast he's found in, and that is in Jerusalem, and that is the Feast of Dedication. Okay, that is the feast that is commemorating the time when the Maccabees were able to clear the temple and cleanse it from the time when Antiochus Epiphanes, back 200 years earlier, had placed the big, what did he place in there? Like the statue of Zeus or something like that? Was it? Okay. So anyway, so he also is in Jerusalem in chapter 10 on the Feast of Dedication. So Jesus has got signs going on. We've got feasts going on. Anyone think of any other significant kind of thing that seems to be like something that is unique to John, that something, kind of a formula that Jesus speaks? A lot of I am statements. So Jesus has got these I am statements going on, and they tend to be metaphorical in nature. I am, I am the bread of life. I am, a clown. No, he doesn't say that. I am, the resurrection and the life. I am the light of the world. And all of these I am statements come out often. They come out of the signs that he does. Okay, they come out of the signs that he does. Now, again, I'm trying to set the table for us a little bit. This is also important to note. In the Synoptic Gospels, the number of miracles that that are recorded within the Synoptic Gospels is far greater, generally, or at least allusions to miracles, is far greater than what we have in John. Okay, there's a lot of miracles taking place in the Synoptics, and in John we have a selected number, right? And what that has allowed John to do, as he's highlighting these particular signs, is it allows John to provide for us, the reader, the dialogue that inevitably ensues after Jesus performs the sign. So after he let's go to him healing the man that was 38 years in illness. After he heals that man, John records this huge long debate and dialogue that occurs between Jesus and the Jewish authorities that are, have seen him do this thing, in this case on the Sabbath, and they're incensed. And it gives Jesus an opportunity, and it gives John to showcase Jesus' opportunity to explain what he's done and to push what he's done, into the Jewish authorities' faces in such a way as to push his identity. Okay? So he does that in chapter 5. He does that in chapter 6 with the Galilee feeding. He feeds the multitude. And then he gets like 65 verses where he like unpacks this thing with the multitude, right? He heals the man born blind. And then he's dialoguing and with the Pharisees that are like, why would you, you did this thing. You made clay. You put it on his eyes on the Sabbath. Like, how dare you? And Jesus is this dialogue with them, right? So John's selectivity of the signs allows him to provide for us much further extensive dialogues between Jesus and his opponents than what we get in the synoptic accounts. Okay?
Ryan,
Yes.
am I not mistaken? John has few, if any, parables, strictly speaking.
That is correct. That is correct. I'm trying to think, does he have any parables? I don't think he has any parables. There's not like that section of parables.
Yeah, I mean, there are scholars that will call them parables loosely, but they're not parables as in the synoptic.
Right, that's correct. And the prodigal son's not in John. So, no, that's Luke. That's Luke 15. So we do have some teaching about, he uses the vine, the whole image of the vine in John 15.
That's kind of clumped together in the I am statements more than, that's I am the vine. That's one of those.
Well, this is part of a whole thing that like talking about the vine and the vine dresser is part of a whole, like several chapters during that last night of his life where he's in the upper room with his disciples. And that is several chapters of detail in that upper room, Jesus speaking more plainly about about departing, Jesus talking about the Spirit coming, Jesus talking about the suffering that they're going to undergo as his disciples, all information that we don't have in that final night in the synoptics. Okay. Now I have like a list. There's so many different, there's so many things that are unique to John, and we could like spend lots of time going through them, and I'm going to need to highlight some of them moving forward in weeks 2, 3, and 4 in order to be able to do what we're doing. One of the other things that I want to mention, though, in the synoptics versus John, we certainly have Jesus being declared the Messiah, being declared the Son of God, being declared the Son of Man, etc., etc. Okay? But in John, we have a Christological focus with Jesus and John's portrayal of Jesus that is not different. Well, it's unique, okay? Am I suggesting that the synoptics don't know Jesus Christologically the way John does? Not necessarily. But the way John chooses to focus on Jesus's identity is unique. In John, you have this whole notion of the Logos becoming flesh. That thing that was in the beginning, that thing became flesh, right? And so then we have in the first chapter, like Jesus being called Rabbi, Christ, Messiah, Son of God, Son of Man, etc., all within the first chapter of John in a way that is unknown in the synoptic accounts. You don't, until Peter's like, declaring Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, here in chapter 8-9 of Mark, and this being like the first time that like the disciples are like, oh, you're the Messiah. Well, they're like, oh, you're the Messiah here in chapter 1 in John. Okay. And then you have all these statements in John along the way about Jesus identifying himself, his actions, his teaching with being the actions and the teachings of the Father. And he ultimately, one of the things that he says in the climax when he gets to Jerusalem, he cries out and he says, he who has seen me has seen the Father. Okay? And these are statements that Jesus makes about himself that we don't have in the synoptic accounts. Now, again, do the synoptic folks don't think that that stuff happened? Do they not know about it? Well, who knows? But John's recording Jesus' identification with the Father in a way that the synoptics don't. And John is also doing one thing else. The synoptic accounts don't know of a pre-existent Jesus. The synoptic accounts do not know of a pre-existent Jesus. And in John's account, and again, there's a debate, lots of debate, everything's debatable, about whether John's actually pointing to Jesus as being pre-existent. But in John's account, we have moments where Jesus is making statements or other people are making statements about Jesus that make it sound as though Jesus is somehow prior to Abraham, for example, okay? Before Abraham, was I am, right? Or Jesus making a statement about no one has ascended to heaven except the Son of Man who himself has descended from heaven, right? These statements that are not made in our synoptic accounts. So, it's getting to be time. I wish we had more time to talk about, and I skipped this over, and we will have to come back to it next week anyway. Number 3, the controlling story and the narrative patterning. So, this is my plea. Well, first of all, any questions? Things that... Okay. So there's difference, right? There's diversity. Is it incompatible diversity? No. Are we going to seek to harmonize the diversity? No, that's not our goal. But we want to use this dialectic to, as Jack mentioned, we want to be able to notice the differences so that, as Ron mentioned, we can begin to ask my essential question, why? Why is John's narrative portrayal of Jesus the way what it is? Can it all be simply boiled down to, well, John thought those other guys had missed some material and he's going to make sure that that material gets out there? While that is undoubtedly part of it, I want to ask the question about the structure. I want to ask the question about some of the main emphases. Why does John choose those? And what we're going to begin with next week is this emphasis of his prologue and this notion of the Logos, and asking the question, how and in what way has John decided to identify Jesus as this Word incarnate? Why has he chosen to do that? And how And in what ways does that affect what he's done in his narrative? So that's where we're going next week. Okay.